The sky bruised, purple and black at the edges, the kind of darkness that didn't come from nightfall alone. Storm clouds rolled across the territory like a living thing, swallowing the last pale light of day whole. The wind carried no rain yet, just the smell of it, sharp and electric, bending the dry grass flat across the open plain. And somewhere above the ridge, lightning split the sky in silence. The thunder would follow. It always did. Caleb Turner stood inside his barn, hands moving by memory, securing bridles and feed sacks he'd secured 100 times before. 43 years old, and the land had never once been gentle to him. It had taken his father early, his wife in childbirth, and his patience year by slow year. What it had left him was the ranch, a streak of iron down his spine, and eyes that knew the difference between an ordinary storm and something worse. This was something worse. The horses felt it. Midnight, his black quarter horse, pawed at the stall floor and blew hard through his nose. The mares bunched together in the far corner like they were bracing. Caleb set his jaw and moved deeper into the barn, checking the latch on every gate. Outside, the wind picked up so fast the doors groaned on their hinges as though the whole structure was breathing against its will. A bridle swung on its peg. Hay scattered off the pile in long golden ribbons. Caleb pressed his hand flat against the post and felt the barn shudder. Then he heard them. Voices, no, not quite voices. Sounds carried sideways on the wind. Fragments of something human beneath the roar of the storm. He went still. His hand found the grip of his revolver without him deciding to reach for it. 15 years on this stretch of frontier had taught his body to react before his mind caught up. The barn doors exploded inward. Before we go further, if you're new here, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Stories like this, we drop them every week. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to know what corner of the world is tuned in tonight. Wind and rain came through the doors like a wall. Caleb stumbled back half a step, gun raised, heart hammering in a way it hadn't in years. The lantern above him swung wildly, throwing shadows in every direction. 3 women stood at the threshold, not stumbling, not on their knees, standing, soaked through to the bone, dresses heavy with rain, hair plastered flat, and yet none of them looked broken. They looked like they'd walked through that storm on purpose. Caleb's eyes moved across them the way a man reads a room before he speaks. The eldest stood slightly ahead of the other 2. She was tall, composed in a way that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with control. She was already scanning the barn, exits, tools, Caleb's gun hand. She'd done this before, assessed danger, and made calculations faster than most men could think. The second one, she looked directly at him. Not past him, not at the gun. At him. Her jaw was set, her chin lifted, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't fear. It was almost a dare, like she was curious what kind of man he'd turn out to be. The youngest was behind them both, arms drawn and close to her chest, fingers twisted together. Her eyes were wide, and her breath came fast. She was frightened, but she hadn't run. That said something. None of them spoke first. Caleb kept the revolver level. This is private land. The eldest woman's gaze finally settled on him. We know. Storm like this, you don't come to a stranger's barn by accident. No, she said. You don't. The silence stretched. Rain hammered the roof, so hard the sound was nearly solid. One of the mares nickered nervously. The second woman, the bold one, let her eyes move around the space slowly, deliberately, like she was deciding whether it would do. Then she looked back at Caleb, and the corner of her mouth lifted. Think you can handle us all? It landed different than it sounded. There was something layered in it. Challenge, exhaustion, maybe even the faintest trace of amusement. Like she'd been holding that line back for exactly the right moment. And this was the moment she'd chosen. Caleb lowered the gun. Just an inch. His eyes stayed sharp. 3 women. No horses he could see. No wagon. They'd come through that storm on foot, through open terrain in the dark. And they'd come here. Specifically here. That wasn't coincidence. That wasn't desperation. That was intention. And trouble with intention was a different animal entirely from trouble that just showed up. He'd dealt with outlaws, with droughts, with creditors who arrived with legal papers and hard smiles. But something about the way these women stood in his doorway, the eldest steady as a post, the youngest holding herself together by sheer will, and the second one looking at him like she already knew how this was going to end, made the hair on his arms stand up. He didn't know their names yet, didn't know where they'd come from or what they were running from, because people didn't cross open country in a storm like that unless something behind them was worse than the weather. What he knew was this: his barn wasn't empty anymore, and whatever they brought with them had walked right through his door. Nobody moved toward the doors. The storm had settled that question without anyone having to say a word. Rain came down in sheets, so thick the opening was just a white roar of noise and water. Lightning strobed across the hills beyond, and each crack of thunder shook the barn hard enough that dust sifted down from the rafters. Caleb glanced once at the gap between the doors and then back at the three women. Going out in that wasn't surviving. It was deciding to die slowly instead of asking for help. He holstered the revolver. "Close them," he said. The eldest woman turned and pulled both barn doors shut against the wind. It took effort. The gale pushed back, but she didn't ask for help, and she didn't struggle long. The latch dropped into place, and the roar outside became a muffled drumming, rain hammering the roof, wind pressing at the walls. The lantern steadied. Shadows stopped jumping. The barn felt smaller now. Closer. Caleb moved back toward the center post and crossed his arms, putting his back to nothing. The horses had quieted some, though midnight still moved restlessly at the far stall. He watched the women the way he watched new horses, without staring directly, taking in the edges of things. The way they stood, what their hands did, where their eyes went. The eldest spoke first. "I'm Naomi." She said it the way a person states a fact they're not ashamed of but aren't offering up for discussion either. Clean and final. She nodded toward the youngest, still hovering near the doors. "That's Lila." Then a half-beat pause, the kind that meant something, before she nodded toward the second woman. "Imani." Imani didn't acknowledge her name. She was already moving, slow and deliberate, along the near wall, eyes tracing the tools hung there, the stacked feed, the bridles on their pegs. Not touching anything, just looking, like she was cataloging. Caleb watched her. "I didn't say you could move around. You didn't say I couldn't." She didn't turn when she said it. The words weren't loud. They weren't angry. They were just placed down in front of him the same way you'd set something heavy on a table. "Here it is. Now what are you going to do about it?" Caleb's jaw tightened once, then released. He'd dealt with difficult men his whole life. He wasn't sure yet what category this was. Naomi's gaze cut briefly to Imani, something passing between them without language, and then she looked back at Caleb. "We're grateful for the shelter. We won't cause trouble. Didn't ask if you would," he said. "Asked why you're here." "The storm." "No." He kept his voice even. "You came through open country. Dark. On foot. In that." He tilted his head toward the doors. "That's not people caught in weather. That's people who had somewhere to be." Naomi didn't flinch. She held his gaze with a steadiness that told him she'd been looked at hard by harder men than him and hadn't blinked once. "We needed shelter," she said. "That's the truth of it tonight." He noticed she said tonight specifically, like she was only making promises that far ahead. Caleb shifted his weight and let his eyes move across all three of them. He did it methodically, the way a man does when he's trying to read a situation rather than a person. The dresses told him things. The hems were mud-caked, not just at the bottom, but up past the knee on Lila's, deep, sucking mud, the kind that came from crossing lowland or creek bed, not just a dry trail gone wet. Naomi's sleeve was torn at the shoulder, a clean diagonal tear, not frayed. Something had snagged it hard and fast, and she hadn't stopped to tend it. Imani had a scrape along her forearm, half-dried and dark at the edges. Recent. They hadn't walked to his door from town. They'd walked from somewhere much farther than that. And they'd walked hard. Lila hadn't spoken. She stood with her back near the wall now, not quite leaning against it, as though she'd allowed herself that much rest, but not more. Her arms were still folded tight across her chest. Her eyes moved to the doors, to the shadows, to Caleb, and then away, and there was a rhythm to it that wasn't curiosity. It was vigilance, the kind a person developed when they'd learned that stillness was safer than drawing attention. She was frightened, yes, but it wasn't the wild fear of someone lost. It was the quiet, contained fear of someone who had learned to carry it and keep walking anyway. That scared him more than the other two combined. Caleb crossed to the supply shelf along the south wall and pulled down a folded horse blanket, then another. He set them on the hay bale nearest the women and stepped back without saying anything about it. Naomi picked one up. Lila took the other and drew it around her shoulders in one careful motion, like she was afraid to make a sound doing it. Imani didn't take one. Floor's dry over there. Caleb pointed toward the far corner, away from the stalls. You can rest till it passes. Naomi nodded once. Thank you. He didn't answer that. He moved back to his post near the center of the barn and settled in, back against the beam, arms loose at his sides. Close enough to the door. Close enough to the stalls. Close enough to all three of them, though he'd have said it different if asked. The storm pressed on. Thunder rolled through in long waves, and between each one, the barn filled with the sounds of horses breathing and hay shifting and the occasional drip of water finding a gap in the roof. Caleb watched the three women without appearing to. Naomi sat upright, back straight, eyes half open. Imani stretched her legs out in front of her and stared at the rafters with an expression he couldn't read. Lila pulled the blanket tighter and finally, slowly, let her eyes close, though her hands never unclenched. None of them slept. None of them trusted the dark enough for that. He turned it over in his mind, slow and careful, the way you work at a knot you can't quite see. Three women. Long travel. Real exhaustion. A calm that wasn't peace. It was practice. These were people who had been afraid for a while. Not today afraid. For a while afraid. And that kind of fear had a source. Something was behind them. He didn't know what. Didn't know how far back. But it was out there past those doors, somewhere in the dark and the rain, and it was the reason they'd walked through open country at night and knocked on a stranger's barn rather than stopping somewhere with a sign and a lamp in the window. Caleb rested his hand loosely near his holster and watched the shadows. The danger tonight wasn't in the storm. It was sitting 12 feet away from him, wrapped in a horse blanket, waiting for morning. It was Lila who broke first. Not with words. Not with tears, exactly. Just a sound, small and involuntary, like something that had been held under pressure for too long, finally finding the thinnest crack to push through. She turned her face toward the wall when it happened. Her shoulders drew up. Her hands pressed flat against her knees. Naomi reached over without looking and laid her hand on Lila's arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. It was the gesture of someone who had done it many times already, on the road, in the dark, in moments nobody else had witnessed. Caleb watched it happen and said nothing. He'd spent enough years alone to know that silence could be a kind of patience. He waited. Naomi straightened. When she spoke, her voice was the same as it had been, measured, deliberate, but something behind it had shifted, like a door not fully open, but unlocked. "There's a man looking for us," she said. Caleb didn't move. What kind of man? The kind that doesn't stop. She paused, and in that pause something careful happened. She was deciding how much truth to spend. His name is Harlan Graves. The lantern flame dipped as a draft pushed through a gap in the wall. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something in him went very still. He knew that name. Anybody who'd been in the territory longer than a season knew that name. Graves owned more land than most men could ride across in a full day. He had lawyers in 3 counties and a reputation that arrived somewhere before he did, so that by the time he showed up in person the work of frightening people was already half done. He wasn't the kind of man you crossed. He was the kind of man you stepped around carefully and hoped never noticed you existed. "What did you do?" Caleb said. It came out flat, no accusation in it, just the shape of the question. "We survived him." Naomi's jaw tightened. That was enough. The silence stretched. Then she continued, and her voice stayed level in the way that costs something, the way a person speaks when they've made the decision to say a hard thing out loud and have set aside the part of themselves that doesn't want to. Their mother's name had been Clara. She'd held 30 acres of bottomland in the south of the territory, land her husband had worked and left to her, land that sat directly between 2 parcels Graves wanted to consolidate. He'd sent men first, then lawyers, then men again. Clara had refused all of it. The land wasn't large. It wasn't valuable the way gold was valuable. But it was hers, and she knew that once it was gone, everything her husband had built and everything she'd raised her daughters on would be gone with it. Graves had come himself the last time. Naomi stopped there for a moment. The kind of stop that isn't hesitation, but is instead the body bracing for what the mouth is about to say. They had watched from the tree line. All three of them, hidden because Clara had sent them there when she heard the horses coming. She had known somehow. Or maybe she had simply prepared for the possibility the way women like her prepared for most things, quietly, ahead of time, without telling her daughters she was afraid. What Graves did when Clara refused him for the last time, they had seen. Every detail of it. And then they had run, because staying meant being the next problem he needed to solve. But before they'd run, Naomi had gone back to the house. There had been papers there, land documents, letters, a ledger their mother had kept in careful handwriting over 2 years. Records of payments made, threats received, names of men who'd done Graves' work and taken his money. Proof that what he'd built had been built on exactly this. On women and families who stood in his way until they couldn't anymore. She'd taken all of it. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The rain on the roof had softened slightly, the worst edge of the storm beginning to pull back, though the darkness outside remained complete. He exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry about your mother," he said. "I mean that." He straightened away from the post. "But this isn't my war." Imani made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Your war," she repeated. She unfolded her legs and sat forward, elbows on her knees, looking at him with those direct eyes that didn't allow distance. "That's a careful way to say it. Makes it sound like a choice you thought through." "It is a choice. It's a wall," she said. "You build it out here in the middle of nothing, and you've been standing behind it. So long you've started calling it principle." She let that land. Harlan Graves is going to come through this territory with men and guns and paper that says he has the right to do whatever he wants. And you sitting alone on 30 acres of dry grass won't make you invisible to that. It'll just mean nobody's standing next to you when it reaches your door. Caleb looked at her. "You don't know anything about me. I know you holstered your gun," she said. "I know you gave us blankets. I know you've been listening for the last hour instead of throwing us back out into the rain." She tilted her head. "That's not a man who wants no part in this. That's a man who's trying to talk himself out of caring." He had no answer for that. Or he had one, but it didn't come. Because Lila was crying now. Not loudly. She turned back from the wall, and the tears came down her face in the steady, exhausted way of someone who has held grief at arm's length for days and simply run out of arm. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. She didn't apologize for it. She just let it happen, her whole body finally giving the loss the room it had been asking for since the tree line. Caleb watched her and felt something move in his chest that he didn't have a name for immediately. He'd buried his father and his brother. He knew what it looked like when a person carried the weight of a death that wasn't just grief, but also guilt. The guilt of still being alive, of having run when running was the only option, of not having been able to stop something that was always going to happen regardless. He recognized it because he'd worn it himself. The last of the thunder rolled away to the south, low and retreating, and the silence it left behind was different from the silence before. Softer, more honest. Caleb looked at the floor for a moment, then looked up. "How many men does Graves send?" he said quietly. Naomi met his eyes. She understood what the question meant. "Enough," she said. Outside, the storm had broken. Something else, in that barn, had broken open too. If this story is pulling you in, like this video right now, and subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? Let's see how wide this story travels. Morning came in quietly, the way it sometimes did after a bad storm. Like the land itself was catching its breath. The rain was gone. The sky had turned a pale, washed-out gray that would burn off to blue by midday. And the air outside carried that particular clean weight that only came after the ground had drunk its fill. Puddles sat in the low places of the yard, still and flat as mirrors. The grass that had been bent flat by the wind the night before stood back up slowly, finding its shape again. Somewhere past the ridge, A bird called once and went quiet. Inside the barn, nobody had slept. Caleb was already on his feet when the first light came through the gaps in the planking. He'd spent the night against the center post, drifting in and out of something that was close to sleep but never fully arrived, his mind moving the same way a river moves around a rock, constantly, without resolution. By the time gray light made the interior visible, he'd already decided what he was going to say. He looked at the three women. Naomi was upright, the blanket folded beside her with a neatness that said she hadn't used it. Imani sat with her back against the wall, awake and watching him the way she'd been watching him half the night. Lila had finally slept, her head tipped sideways, her breathing slow and even, her hands unclenched at last in a way they hadn't been for hours. Caleb went to the doors and pushed them open. Morning air moved through the barn, cool and damp. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his hands braced on either side of the frame, looking out at his land. The modest scatter of it. The barn, the house, the fence line. 20 head of cattle somewhere past the east pasture. The wooden crosses behind the main building, catching the early light. He'd built this, buried the people he'd built it with, kept it going alone because keeping it going was the only way to honor what it had cost. He turned back inside. Storm's past, he said. His voice came out level but not unkind. You can move safely now, before the day gets going. Naomi rose to her feet in one smooth motion. She understood him. She'd understood him before he'd spoken. Probably had been waiting for exactly these words since she'd opened her eyes. She reached down and touched Lila's shoulder gently, and Lila woke with the quiet alertness of someone who had trained themselves not to wake confused. Imani didn't move. She watched Caleb with an expression that wasn't anger and wasn't surprise. It was something closer to recognition, the particular look of someone watching a thing happen that they expected but had hoped against. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Caleb walked out to the fence line to check the post the wind had rattled, and that was that. Where it was supposed to be. He was at the far fence when he saw them. Riders. Still distant, just shapes against the pale horizon, moving along the high ridge road that ran parallel to his property before it dropped down toward the valley. He counted without meaning to. 4. No, 5. Moving in a loose line. No urgency in their pace, the way men moved when they were searching rather than traveling. Heads turning, pausing at the high points where a view opened up. Looking, Caleb stood very still at the fence post and watched them the way a man watches something he is calculating the distance of. His hand hung at his side, near the revolver he'd worn out of habit when he'd stepped outside. The riders hadn't reached the cut in the ridge yet. Another few minutes, and they'd have a clear line of sight down to the property. He walked back to the barn at an even pace. Not running. Running told the land you were scared, and the land had a way of broadcasting that. He came through the doors, and all three women read his face before he said a word. Naomi's chin lifted. Lila's hand went to her sister's sleeve. Imani finally stood. How many? Naomi said. 5. Ridge Road, coming south. He pulled the doors, mostly closed. They're looking, not riding hard. They haven't spotted the property yet. He watched Lila's face go pale in a way that had nothing performative in it. She pressed her lips together, and her eyes filled but didn't spill, and she straightened her spine with a visible effort that cost her something real. She moved closer to Naomi without a word. Imani crossed to the gap in the doors and looked through it. One long look. Then she turned back, and her voice was flat and certain. I'm not running again. That's not a plan, Caleb said. It's the only one I have left. She met his eyes. We've been running for 4 days. We ran through a night and a storm, and we ended up here. There is no more road that doesn't lead back to him. Naomi spoke carefully. If we move east through the dry creek bed. They'll have the creek bed covered, Caleb said. He said it quietly, because saying it quietly was the only way to say something that closed the door. Man like Graves doesn't send 5 riders without sending 5 more somewhere else. The silence that followed was the heaviest kind. The kind that meant everyone in the room had arrived at the same truth from different directions. Caleb stood in the middle of his barn and looked at these 3 women. He looked at Naomi, who was made of control and responsibility and grief she never put down. He He looked at Imani, whose anger was just love with nowhere left to go. He looked at Lila, who was trembling in a way she was trying to hide and standing with her sisters anyway, because standing was the only answer she had left. He thought about his father, his brother, the wooden crosses in the morning light. He thought about the kind of man he'd been before the land took everything from him, and the kind of man he'd allowed himself to become in the years since. Smaller, quieter, safe in the way that a thing sealed shut is safe, nothing getting in, nothing getting out. Imani had called it a wall. She wasn't wrong. Caleb turned and looked out through the gap in the doors at his property. At the ridge, where 5 riders were still moving, still searching, still believing they were the most dangerous thing in this valley. He let out a slow breath. "Get away from the doors," he said quietly. "Stay low, stay back from the windows." He reached up and unlatched his spare rifle from the wall mount above the feed shelf, a thing he hadn't touched in 2 years, and checked the chamber with the practiced ease of muscle memory. "Don't move until I tell you." Naomi looked at him. "You don't have to do this." "I know." He levered the rifle closed. "That's why I'm doing it." Nobody moved. The barn was silent except for horses breathing and the distant sound of hooves growing slowly, incrementally louder on the ridge road. Caleb positioned himself at the door. Whatever this land had been before this morning, his refuge, his penance, his isolation, it was something different now. It had edges again, something worth standing in front of. He didn't know yet what it would cost him. He stood there anyway. The riders hadn't come down off the ridge. They'd paused at the high point. Caleb had watched them through the gap in the barn doors, 5 shapes against the pale morning sky, and then moved on east, following the road as it curved away from the valley. Whether they'd seen the property and decided against it, or whether the angle had hidden it from their line of sight, he couldn't say. What he knew was that they'd be back. Men like Graves didn't send riders out once. They sent them out in rotations, tightening the circle each time, until the circle had nowhere left to go. He had time, not much of it, and none to waste. By midday, Caleb had walked every inch of the property with the eyes of a man seeing it for the first time. He forced himself to look at it the way a threat would, from the outside in, from the high ground down from the road and the creek bed and the tree line at the eastern edge of the pasture. What he saw was a ranch built for survival against weather and poverty, not against men. Open sight lines in the wrong places. The barn doors faced the road directly. The main house had one entrance and windows that sat too low. The fence line offered cover to anyone approaching from the north. He spent the afternoon fixing what he could and accounting for what he couldn't. Posts were reinforced. Feed sacks were stacked against the lower windows of the house, thick enough to slow a bullet. He pulled boards from the back of the storage shed and cut them into lengths he could use to brace the barn doors from the inside. He moved the horses to the rear stalls, away from the road-facing wall. He found the 2 positions on the property that gave the widest view of the approach, one at the corner of the barn roof, one behind the water trough near the fence, and he stood at each of them long enough to understand what could be seen and what couldn't. Then he went inside and looked at the 3 women who were now, whether he'd planned it or not, part of whatever came next. "I need to know what you can do," he said. Naomi answered without hesitation. "Tell us what you need." He started with the rifles the following morning, early, before the heat came up. Naomi picked it up fast. Not just the mechanics of it, the loading, the stance, the breath before the trigger, but the thinking behind it. When Caleb showed her the 2 positions he'd identified on the property, she stood at each one in silence, and then asked him questions that surprised him. About angles, about where a group of riders would naturally spread when they entered the yard, and which position covered the most ground with the fewest steps between them. She wasn't just learning to shoot. She was learning the geometry of a fight. Within 2 days, she'd moved from student to something closer to partner, the 2 of them standing at the fence line in the early mornings with coffee going cold in their hands, talking through scenarios in low voices while the land woke up around them. Imani was a different story. She didn't need instruction on the mechanics. She needed instruction on the patience, and she didn't want it. The first time she fired, the shot went wide, and she reloaded without flinching and fired again and again and again, working through it by pure force rather than technique. Jaws set, eyes hard. By the end of the first session, the targets Caleb had set up on the fence posts were consistently hit. By the end of the second, they were hit where he told her to hit them. She shot like she did everything else, with an anger underneath it that had been sharpened by grief into something precise and functional. After one evening session, when the others had gone inside, she stood at the fence line and kept shooting until the light was nearly gone. Caleb stood back and watched and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. He understood the thing she was working through. He'd done versions of it himself, in the years after the cholera took his family, found physical tasks to pour the grief into, worked until his hands bled, stayed outside until he was too tired to feel anything but the weight of his own body. He didn't interrupt it. He just stayed until she finished and then walked inside ahead of her so she could have a walk back alone. Lila struggled. The first time she held the rifle, her hands shook enough that Caleb reached over and steadied the barrel without making a point of it. She flinched at the sound of the shot, even when she was the one firing it. She apologized twice, and both times he told her plainly that there was nothing to apologize for. On the third day, she hit the target. Not cleanly and not consistently, but she hit it. She looked up with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not relief exactly, but something harder than that. Something decided. She didn't apologize again after that. In the evenings, they ate together at the table in the main house, because eating separately felt like a performance of distance that none of them had the energy for anymore. The meals were simple. Whatever the ranch produced, stretched across 4 plates. Conversation arrived slowly, the way it did between people who were still deciding how much of themselves to put down. Caleb learned that Naomi had kept accounts for her mother's land since she was 16. That Imani had once worked a horse from wild to rideable in 11 days on a bet and won. That Lila could name every plant in the valley's dry scrub by sight and knew which ones healed and which ones harmed. He told them less, but he told them some things. He told them about his father's hands, how they'd looked holding a hammer, how the memory of them was clearer to him sometimes than the man's face. He told them the ranch had a name once, that his mother had named it before she died, and that he'd stopped using the name when she was gone because saying it alone felt too much like talking to himself. He said it like he was reporting something, without sentiment, but he said it. Naomi listened to all of it with the quality of attention that made a person feel their words were being stored carefully rather than just heard. Imani listened too, though she covered it by looking somewhere else. Word started coming in through the valley's slow channels. A traveling merchant who stopped at the fence line to water his horse. A neighboring rancher's boy who rode past with a message that wasn't quite direct, but wasn't accidental either. Grays had been seen at the county seat, spending time with men who wore badges. A family 2 valleys over had been given 30 days to vacate land they'd held for a generation. A woman whose husband had testified against one of Gray's men had found her fences cut and her cattle scattered without explanation. The territory was being reorganized, quietly, systematically, the way a man rearranges a room before the guests arrive, so that by the time anyone noticed, the furniture was already where he wanted it. Caleb heard all of it and filed it behind his eyes. One evening after supper, Naomi spread the document her mother had kept across the kitchen table, and they went through them together, Caleb and Naomi, while Imani cleaned the rifle at the far end of the table and Lila dried the dishes at the basin. The ledger entries were precise, dated, detailed. Names, amounts, dates of contact. Evidence of a pattern so deliberate and so long-running that the size of it took a moment to settle. Caleb read it twice and sat back. If this reached the right people, he said carefully. It has to reach them first, Naomi said. The lamp between them threw their shadows long across the wall. Outside, the night was still and clear, no weather coming, no sound from the road. The kind of quiet that in another life Caleb would have called peaceful. He knew better now. The stillness outside wasn't the land resting. It was the land holding its breath. If this story has its hooks in you, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And tell me, who do you think makes it out of this alive? They came at night, the way cowards always do. No warning, no call, just the sound of hooves on dry ground coming fast out of the darkness, and then the first shot punching through the barn wall, so close to Caleb's head that he felt the air move before he heard the crack of it. He was off his bedroll and moving before his mind had caught up with his body, reaching for the rifle on pure instinct, shouting one word toward the house. Now! They drilled for this. 3 evenings in a row, moving through the scenario in daylight until the positions were in muscle memory rather than thought. Naomi to the rear window of the house, covering the north approach. Imani to the barn side door, the angle that covered the road and the fence line simultaneously. Caleb at the main doors. Lila, and this had been the hardest conversation, the one where Naomi had gone quiet, and Lila had said, "Simply I know what to do," covering the interior of the house, the documents wrapped in oilskin and tucked beneath the floorboard of the back room. The drill had felt abstract in daylight. It didn't feel abstract now. Gunfire came from 3 directions at once, which meant they'd been positioned in advance. Riders out in the dark waiting for a signal, patient in the way hired men were patient when they were being paid enough. Caleb fired through the gap in the barn doors and heard a shout, and then hooves scrambling sideways. He didn't stop to determine what the shout meant. He reloaded and moved to the second position, the one behind the grain stack, because staying still was dying. From the house came 2 shots in quick succession. Naomi's rhythm, controlled and deliberate even now. Then a 3rd shot from the side door of the barn, louder and faster, no pause between the decision and the action. Imani, a man's voice from outside the fence line, called something Caleb couldn't make out over the horses screaming in their stalls. Midnight had kicked through the back wall of his stall and was against the far corner, whites showing around his eyes. Caleb couldn't do anything for him now. He moved back to the main doors. The attack lasted 11 minutes by the clock, though it felt like an hour lived in individual seconds. When the riders pulled back, regrouping, calculating, the silence they left behind was so sudden it rang. Caleb stood with his back against the barn wall and let himself breathe once hard before he started moving. He found Imani at the side door, reloading. A graze along her left forearm, fresh and bleeding, that she hadn't mentioned and wasn't going to. He found Naomi at the rear window, still watching the dark. He found Lila inside the house, standing in the main room with the rifle against her shoulder, aimed at the front door, hands no longer shaking. She'd fired. The mark on the door frame told him that a shot that had gone through the front window and found the man who'd tried to come through it. He was gone now, pulled back with the others. But the shot had been fired. Nobody said anything about it. Lila lowered the rifle slowly and exhaled, and that was the whole conversation. They'd survived the first night. The damage was real. A section of the fence line was down. A corner of the barn's north wall had taken enough shots that daylight came through it in thin lines. One of the Mares had a cut on her flank from a splinter, and Caleb knew, standing in the quiet after, that this had been a test. Not the full force of what Graves could send. A probe, a measurement of what they had, which meant what was coming next would be larger. It came 4 days later. Caleb saw the dust first from the roof position just after dawn, a line of it rising along the ridge road, too wide and too sustained to be a handful of riders. He counted what he could and stopped counting when the numbers stopped matching. He came down off the roof and walked into the house and looked at the 3 women eating breakfast and said, "He's coming himself." Nobody asked how he knew. They just stood up. The storm arrived with Graves, as though the sky had been waiting for him. Clouds came in from the west fast and dark, the same bruised purple they'd been the night the sisters had first walked through the barn doors. Thunder started low and distant and built steadily, and by the time Graves' men had surrounded the property on 3 sides, the wind was already pulling at the grass and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. Lightning walked along the ridge in slow, deliberate steps. Caleb registered all of it and filed it away. Weather was weather. It didn't choose sides. The assault began without preamble. It was nothing like the first attack that had been sharp and focused, designed to probe. This was designed to end it. Men came from the fence line and the road and the eastern tree line simultaneously, using the structure of the property itself against them, the way Caleb had feared they would. The barn became the center of everything. The 4 of them moving through it under fire, using every corner and angle they'd memorized, communicating in short words and gestures because there was no time for sentences. Naomi moved through the chaos like a current through water, finding the gaps, directing without shouting, repositioning when a line of fire closed, and opening another before the first had fully shut. She had the ledger in her mind at all times, the tactical ledger she'd been building since the first morning, and she spent it carefully under pressure. Imani fought like the anger had finally found its proper shape. She didn't fall back when Caleb called it. She held the side door position past the point where holding it was reasonable and extracted a cost from every man who came at that angle. At one point, she was down to her last loaded cylinder, and she drew the knife at her belt without breaking her footing, and the man who'd thought the empty gun meant to fight was overlearned otherwise. The rain came down hard when Caleb took the shot. He felt it before he fully understood it, a punch above his left hip, enough force to put him against the barn wall, the rifle leaving his hands. He got the back. He stayed on his feet. But the world narrowed at the edges, and his left side stopped cooperating the way he needed it to. And he knew from the particular quality of the pain that the next few minutes were going to require everything he had left. He gave them everything he had left. They pushed into the barn eventually. Graves' men, the ones still standing, forcing the four of them back through the structure until they were at the rear wall. No more angles to use, no more positions to retreat to. Caleb put himself in front of the women by instinct, and Imani moved out from behind him by equal instinct. And for a moment, the four of them stood in a line in the back of the barn. They defended together and faced the men coming through the smoke. Harlan Graves came through the main doors last. He was older than Caleb had expected, heavier. He moved with the unhurried authority of a man who had never once arrived at a situation he hadn't already controlled before entering it. He looked at Caleb against the wall, wounded and still standing, and his expression held something that wasn't quite contempt but was adjacent to it, the look of a man who had seen stubborn things before and knew precisely how they ended. His eyes moved to the sisters. "I'll have the papers," he said, "and then we'll be done here." The barn was quiet except for the rain hammering the roof and the sound of the horses and Caleb's breathing, which was costing him more than he wanted it to. Then Lila stepped forward. Not Naomi, not Imani. Lila, who had flinched at the first gunshot, who had apologized for shaking hands, who had pressed herself against walls in the dark and wept quietly for a mother she hadn't been able to save. She stepped forward and her hands did not shake. She held the oilskin packet in one hand and the revolver in the other, and she looked at Harlan Graves across the length of the barn with eyes that had no more fear left in them. Not because the fear was gone, but because she had decided it was no longer in charge. "This goes to the federal marshal," she said. Her voice was steady. "Every name, every date, every man you paid, and every family you took." She let him look at the packet long enough to understand what it was. "You killed our mother for land. Every piece of what you built is in here." Graves looked at her the way powerful men looked at things that surprised them, with a coldness that was really the fast adjustment of a man recalculating. He reached for the gun at his hip. The shot came from Lila's revolver before his hand had closed around the grip. Harlan Graves fell, not slowly, not dramatically. He simply went down the way things went down when the thing holding them up was suddenly gone, and the sound of it was lost in a crack of thunder so large it shook the barn walls and rattled every bridle on every peg. And then the rain came down harder than it had all night, and the men who'd come in behind Graves looked at each other and made the calculation that men made when the person they'd been paid to follow was on the ground, and the payment had no one left to authorize it. They left, one by one, then all at once. The barn was silent. Caleb slid down the wall slowly until he was sitting against it, hand pressed to his side, watching Lila lower the revolver. She stood over what she'd done and breathed and didn't look away from it. Naomi came to her from the left and put both arms around her from behind and held on without saying anything. Imani came from the right and stood close, not touching, just present, a wall of a different kind. Outside, the storm began to pass. The rain softened. The thunder moved away south the way it had the first night, retreating, leaving the land to settle into itself. A pale gray light began to build at the edges of the sky. Caleb looked at his barn, his property, the crosses behind the house, visible now in the early light. He looked at the three women standing together in the center of it all. The ranch had held. So had they. The last shot faded into the hills like a rumor, and then there was nothing. No more hooves on hard ground. No more voices calling out in the dark. The men were gone. The guns were still. The only sound left in the world was rain on the barn roof and the slow, uneven rhythm of Caleb's breathing against the wall. Nobody moved for a long moment. It was the kind of silence that lands differently when you've been inside noise that loud for that long. Not peaceful, not yet, but real. The kind of silence that means something is over. Caleb became aware of it the way a man becomes aware he's been clenching his jaw for hours, all at once, and with the ache that comes after. He let himself slide further down the wall until he was fully on the ground. Naomi was at his side before he decided to allow it. She didn't ask. She pulled the side of his coat back and looked at the wound with the focused, unhurried calm of someone who had seen worse and knew panic was a luxury. Her hands were steady. That surprised him, though he couldn't have said why. She'd been steady since the barn doors. It went through, she said. Not reassurance. Just the fact of it. He nodded once. Imani appeared at the side door, the knife back at her belt, the graze on her forearm wrapped roughly in a strip of cloth she'd torn from somewhere. She looked at Caleb on the ground, looked at Naomi working, looked at Lila standing in the center of the barn, still holding the revolver loosely at her side. And then she crossed her arms and leaned against the post and said nothing at all. But she stayed. That was the whole of it for a while. The four of them in the barn in the quiet after, the storm pulling slowly back to the south the way it had come, leaving the land wet and cooling and still. The lawmen came with the morning. Not the county men who had been in Gray's pocket, nodding at whatever he said and looking the other direction when looking cost them. These were federal marshals, two of them, riding out of the gray early light with badges that hadn't been borrowed or bought. Someone had sent word. Someone who had received Naomi's copies of the ledger, the letters, the careful handwriting of a woman named Clara who had known that the truth needed more than one road to travel. Naomi had been thorough. She'd always been thorough. The marshals walked through the barn and the house and asked their questions, and Naomi answered all of them in the same measured voice she used for everything. The voice that wasn't cold but wasn't open either, that gave only what was needed and kept the rest. She laid the original ledger on the kitchen table and watched one of the marshals read it without expression. And when he looked up at her, she held his gaze until he looked back down. Harlan Graves had been a large man in life. In death, on paper, he was simply the last entry in a ledger that had been waiting for someone to close it. His empire didn't collapse loudly. That was the thing Caleb hadn't expected. He'd imagined it as something dramatic. Riders scattering, lawyers fleeing, something that announced itself. Instead, it simply stopped. The men who had ridden for Graves stopped being paid and went elsewhere. The lawyers filed papers and withdrew. The families who had been given 30 days found that nobody came on the 31st. The land that had been seized through threat and manipulation went back to the courts, where the ledger and its careful dates and names made the arguments that Clara had not been alive to make herself. It took weeks. It was not clean, but it moved in one direction. The sisters were no longer hunted. That truth arrived quietly, the way most truths did. There was no single moment when it became real, just a gradual loosening like a rope that had been cut but still had to be unwound. Naomi was the first to sleep through the night. She didn't mention it. Caleb noticed because he'd been awake himself when it happened, lying in the loft listening to the particular silence of the house, and realizing that for the first time since the barn doors had blown open in the storm, no one was keeping watch. He stayed awake a while longer, out of habit. Then he let himself sleep too. The ranch changed in small ways first. Laughter came back to it before anything else. Not Caleb's. He'd never been a man who filled a space with sound, but Lila's, unexpected and bright, breaking out of her one afternoon when midnight knocked the feed bucket sideways and wore it briefly on his nose before shaking it free. She laughed so suddenly that she put her hand over her mouth, as if she'd forgotten that was allowed. Then she laughed harder. Imani, who was mending the fence line 10 yards away, turned around to see what had happened, and something in her expression did something complicated that ended in something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough. The stillness that had sat over the property for years began to go. There was movement in it now. Real movement, not the vigilant kind, not the kind with one ear always toward the road. Naomi reorganized the kitchen with the thoroughness she brought to everything and discovered, apparently to her own satisfaction, that she had opinions about where the dry goods should be kept and was not shy about stating them. She and Caleb had their first disagreement about it, a real one, specific and unhurried, the kind that only happened between people who expected to be in the same place long enough for the outcome to matter. He lost. He didn't mind. Imani was harder. She didn't soften quickly or obviously. What changed was the quality of her tension, the way it slowly stopped being pointed outward and became something else, something quieter and less ready to strike. She still went to the fence line every evening and stood with her back to the house and looked at the ridge, and Caleb had stopped trying to understand what she was looking for. One evening, he brought her a cup of coffee and set it on the post next to her without comment and went back inside. And when he looked from the window, 20 minutes later, she was still there, hands around the cup, something in her posture that was less like a soldier and more like a person. Lila healed in ways that were hard to name precisely, but easy to see in accumulation. The flinching stopped, mostly. The hands unclenched. She began to take up space, small amounts, cautiously at first, then with more certainty, as though she was testing the theory that the world wouldn't punish her for existing in it. She started spending time in the barn alone with the horses, not to work but just to be near them, and midnight, suspicious and difficult by nature, tolerated her with a patience he extended to almost no one else. Caleb observed this and thought that the horse had better judgment than he was usually given credit for. She didn't talk about the night she had stepped forward. None of them did. It lived between them the way important things did. Present but not needing to be named, a shared weight that had become shared because they'd all been standing in the same place when it happened. Caleb said the name of his daughter aloud for the first time in years one evening in November. He said it without deciding to. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low, and Naomi was across from him, reading her mother's letters again. She did this sometimes, working through them slowly, putting them in order of something only she could see, and he said the name into the quiet and felt the shape of it change slightly in his mouth, like it had been closed somewhere and opened. Naomi looked up. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. She looked at him the way she looked at things she was deciding to keep, and then she went back to the letters. That was enough. More than enough. More than he'd had in a long time. The ranch had been a quiet place for years. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the empty kind, the kind that comes from a space built for more people than are in it. The rooms had been too large for one man. The table had been too long. There had been corners of the property that Caleb stopped going to because walking through them alone felt too much like visiting something he'd lost. It didn't feel that way anymore. The table was the right size now. The rooms were occupied in ways that were audible and present. The specific creak of Lila's footsteps in the morning, the particular way Imani came in from outside and closed the door with more force than necessary, the sound of Naomi's voice when she was thinking through a problem out loud and had decided the room counted as privacy enough. The house held all of it and still had room, and Caleb moved through it differently than he had before. Not careful of the space anymore. Not trying to take up less of it than it deserved. He had not set out to find this. He had set out to secure his barn in a storm. What he had found instead was something he hadn't known he was still looking for, a thing that had no proper name in the language he'd grown up with, that wasn't family exactly as he'd understood it, but was something that worked the same way, something that knew him and stayed anyway, something he could come home to in the dark and know it would be there. The storm that had brought them all together was long gone now. It had moved through the territory the way storms did, hard and fast and indifferent to what it left behind. It had broken fences and scattered cattle and made the roads impassable for days. It had driven 3 women through open country in the dark to a stranger's barn. It had set everything into motion that followed. But storms didn't build things. That was always the work that came after. What remained when the weather passed was this. For people around a table in lamplight, each of them carrying something they'd survived, each of them changed by what it had cost. Not healed the way broken things were healed. The cracks were still there, The marks of everything they'd come through, but whole in a different way. Whole in the way that chose to be together instead of apart. Whole in the way that had looked at the emptiness and decided to fill it. The winter came in slow that year, the first cold arriving without violence, settling over the land in a way that felt almost gentle. The nights were long and the fire burned late, and there was something that gathered around it in the evenings that had no word for itself but didn't need one. The storm was gone, but it had left behind something that storms rarely did. It had left behind a home. That's the end of the story, and if it reached you the way I hope it did, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Every week, we bring you voices from history that didn't get the pages they deserved. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from? And which one of them stayed with you? Share this with someone tonight who needs to hear a story about surviving and what comes after. Because the surviving is never really the point. What we build in the quiet after, that's the point.